Miss Marple and the Avenger from the Cold War. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1, Trunk Call. At 8:45, the fog that evening came creeping across the fields of St. Mary Mead like some gray malevolent creature seeking shelter in the village's familiar corners. It curled around the ancient oak on the green, obscured the weathered stones of St. Mary's Church, and settled with particular persistence around the bright red telephone box that stood sentinel beside the village green. Sir Lionel Hesketh paused at his study window, watching the mist thicken. He was a man of precise habits and courteous demeanor, his silver hair impeccably groomed despite his 73 years. The retirement from the home office had suited him well. The quiet rhythms of St. Mary Mead provided a welcome contrast to the shadowy corridors of Whitehall, where he had spent the better part of 4 decades. The telephone line appears to be quite dead. "I'm afraid," announced Mrs. Francis Alder, his secretary housekeeper, as she entered the study with his evening tea. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with the sort of efficient manner that had made her invaluable during Sir Lionel's final years in government service. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark dress was as precisely pressed as always. Sir Lionel turned from the window, accepting the delicate china cup with a nod of thanks. "Most inconvenient timing, Francis. I'm expecting rather an important call this evening." "From London, sir?" "Further afield, I believe. An old acquaintance from Berlin." He sipped his tea thoughtfully. "We arranged that he should ring the public telephone box at 8:45 precisely. The arrangements were made some days ago, and he will be expecting the call to connect." Mrs. Alder's eyebrows rose slightly. In all her years of service, Sir Lionel had never conducted business from the village telephone box. "Shall I walk down and test the public line, sir?" "That would be most helpful, Francis, though I suspect our friend will manage well enough." "He's a resourceful sort." As Mrs. Alder departed on her errand, Sir Lionel returned to his contemplation of the fog. Through the gray curtain, he could just make out the red bulk of the telephone box, its cheerful color muted by the evening mist. He had not spoken to Klaus Hoffmann for nearly 8 years, not since that unfortunate business in Berlin. But the letter that had arrived the previous week had been quite explicit in its arrangements, and Klaus had never been one to make idle contact. The clock on the mantel struck 8:30. Sir Lionel finished his tea, straightened his tie, and reached for his overcoat. The fog would be unpleasant, but punctuality had always been one of his cardinal virtues. Mrs. Alder returned as he was adjusting his muffler. "The public line appears to be working perfectly, Sir Lionel. I was able to reach the operator without difficulty." "Excellent. I shall return presently." The fog embraced him the moment he stepped outside, damp and clinging like cold breath. The familiar paths of the village green seemed somehow unfamiliar in the mist, the usual landmarks obscured or transformed into mysterious shapes. The church tower loomed like a gray giant, and the cottage windows glowed with warm yellow light that seemed to belong to another world entirely. As Sir Lionel approached the telephone box, he noted with satisfaction that it appeared unoccupied. The interior light cast a welcoming glow through the fog, and he could see that someone had recently cleaned the glass panels. He checked his pocket watch. 8:42. Hoffmann had always been punctual to the minute. The village seemed unusually quiet for the evening hour. Through the mist he could see the warm lights of the Blue Boar, where no doubt the regulars were settling in for their evening pints. A figure emerged from the direction of the vicarage. Miss Margaret Phelps, he thought, though it was difficult to be certain in the fog. She appeared to be carrying something, walking with the purposeful stride of someone on a specific errand. At precisely 8:45, the telephone began to ring. Sir Lionel entered the red box and closed the door behind him, shutting out the damp fog. The interior was blessedly dry and well lit, though he noticed an odd chill that seemed to emanate from somewhere near the floor. He lifted the receiver on the fourth ring. Hesketh speaking. The voice that answered was heavily accented but unmistakably familiar. "Mein lieber Lionel, it has been too long." "Klaus, I received your letter." "Yes, the letter. But you understand there are things that cannot be written even now. Things that require the personal touch, you comprehend." Sir Lionel shifted uncomfortably. The chill in the telephone box seemed to be growing more pronounced, and he found himself oddly short of breath. "I understood from your correspondence that the matter we discussed in 1947 had been resolved." A pause crackled across the international line. "Ah, resolved. Yes, in a manner of speaking. But you know how these things are, Maine. Sometimes the past, it reaches forward with cold fingers." The metaphor struck Sir Lionel as oddly appropriate. The cold in the telephone box was becoming quite noticeable, pooling around his feet like an icy pond. He found himself having to concentrate on his breathing. "Klaus, I'm afraid the connection is rather poor. Perhaps we might—" "The connection is perfect. It is other things that are poor, Lionel. Other things that have grown cold with time." Sir Lionel's vision began to blur slightly. The conversation seemed to be taking place at a great distance, though Hoffman's voice remained clear in his ear. He leaned against the wall of the telephone box, suddenly feeling every one of his 73 years. "The courier," Hoffman's voice continued, now seeming to come from very far away. "You remember the courier?" "Yes, the one who did not return from London in 1947. "I remember," Sir Lionel whispered, though he wasn't entirely certain he had spoken aloud. "Gut. Then you understand why I called tonight. Why it is important that we speak of these things now while there is still time." But Sir Lionel found he could no longer respond. The cold had risen around him like a tide, and his breathing had become labored and shallow. Through the glass panels of the telephone box, the fog seemed to press inward, as though the entire world had become gray and airless. His last coherent thought, as consciousness faded, was that Klaus Hoffmann's voice had grown strangely distant, though the receiver remained pressed to his ear. Outside in the fog, a church clock struck 9. Chapter 2. A Body in the Red Box. Constable Sanders had been making his evening rounds for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time he had never quite grown accustomed to the way fog could transform the familiar streets of St. Mary Mead into something almost foreign. Tonight was particularly troublesome, with visibility reduced to mere yards, and the usual landmarks swallowed by the gray murk. It was 20 minutes to 9 when he approached the telephone box on the village green, his torch cutting a weak beam through the mist. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The red paintwork gleamed dully in the torchlight, and the interior bulb cast its usual welcoming glow. It was only as he drew closer that Sanders noticed the door was firmly shut, unusual, for that time of evening when most folk would have finished their calls and gone home to their firesides. "Hello there," he called softly, tapping on the glass with his knuckle. "Everything all right?" No response came from within. Sanders pressed his face to the glass and peered inside, his breath fogging the exterior surface. What he saw made him step back sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his whistle. Sir Lionel Hesketh sat slumped against the back wall of the telephone box, his silver head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes closed. The telephone receiver dangled from its cord, swaying gently like a pendulum, counting out the seconds of eternity. Sanders tried the door and found it unlocked. As he pulled it open, he was struck by an odd chill that seemed to pour from the box like water from an overturned pitcher. The air inside felt thick and strangely heavy, with an almost metallic taste that made him unconsciously hold his breath. "Sir Lionel?" He reached out tentatively and touched the elderly gentleman's shoulder. The body was still warm, but there was no response, no flutter of breath or pulse of life. Sanders had seen enough in his years of service to know that Sir Lionel Hesketh would not be answering any more telephone calls. Within 20 minutes, the telephone box had become the center of considerable activity. Dr. Haydock arrived first, his medical bag clutched firmly in one hand and a hurricane lamp in the other. Inspector Slack followed shortly after, his naturally suspicious demeanor heightened by the unusual circumstances. "Natural causes, you think, Doctor?" Slack inquired, watching as Dr. Haydock conducted his preliminary examination. The doctor, a man of about 60 with gentle hands and shrewd eyes, shook his gray head slowly. "There are definite signs of asphyxiation, Inspector. Note the bluish tinge around the lips and fingernails and the slight congestion of the features. But there's no obvious violence, no signs of struggle. Heart attack, perhaps. The shock of not being able to breathe properly, possibly. Though Sir Lionel's heart was sound enough when I examined him last month. He was in remarkably good health for a man of his years." Inspector Slack frowned and turned his attention to the telephone box itself. The receiver still hung from its cord, and when he lifted it to his ear, he could hear nothing but the steady hum of a dead line. On the floor of the box, scattered coins caught the light, several sixpences that appeared to have jammed somehow in the coin slot mechanism. "Foreign agents," he muttered darkly. "Mark my words, Doctor. This has all the hallmarks of foreign interference. A man like Sir Lionel, with his government connections, he'd be a natural target." It was at this moment that Miss Jane Marple arrived, accompanied by her old friend, Lady Bantry. The two elderly ladies had been taking their evening constitutional despite the fog when they'd noticed the unusual commotion around the telephone box. "Oh, my dear," Lady Bantry exclaimed, her plump face creased with concern. "Not Sir Lionel? Such a courteous gentleman. Whatever could have happened?" Miss Marple said nothing immediately, but her sharp blue eyes took in every detail of the scene with the thoroughness of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. She was a small, neat woman with silver hair and an air of gentle inquiry that often led people to underestimate her considerable powers of observation. "Inspector Slack," she said presently, "might I have a closer look? I promise not to disturb anything." Slack, who had learned through bitter experience to respect Miss Marple's uncanny insights, grudgingly stepped aside. "Just don't touch anything, mind. This is a crime scene, or near enough." Miss Marple approached the telephone box with careful steps, her keen gaze moving methodically from top to bottom. The first thing she noticed was the pattern of condensation on the glass panels. While the fog had left its mark on the exterior surfaces, the interior showed a curious distribution of moisture, heavy fogging on the lower portions of the glass, but relatively clear above what she estimated to be roughly the 3-foot mark. "How very interesting," she murmured, crouching down with surprising agility for a woman of her years. Along the metal kick rail at the bottom of the telephone box, she could see a faint powdery residue that caught the light like scattered flour. "What is it, Jane?" Lady Bantry inquired, leaning forward with curiosity. "Frost, I believe, Dolly, though that seems rather odd, doesn't it? The evening is certainly chilly, but hardly freezing." Miss Marple rose and stepped back, her gaze now encompassing the area immediately surrounding the telephone box. Behind the red structure, partially concealed by its bulk, sat a round tin that appeared to have been hastily abandoned. The lid was askew, revealing a dark interior that seemed to absorb the torchlight. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you'll want to examine this." Slack approached reluctantly, clearly torn between professional duty and his instinct to dismiss the observations of amateur detectives. When Miss Marple indicated the tin, however, his expression grew more serious. "Biscuit tin," he observed. Huntley and Palmer's by the look of it. Indeed, though I suspect it hasn't contained biscuits for some time. Dr. Haydock joined them, his examination of Sir Lionel's body complete. The preliminary cause of death appears to be asphyxiation, he reported, though the mechanism remains unclear. There are no obvious signs of strangulation or suffocation by external means. Miss Marple knelt beside the abandoned tin and examined it closely without touching. The interior surface appeared to be covered with a fine white coating that reminded her of the frost she'd observed along the kick rail of the telephone box. More intriguing still was the felt padding that lined the lid, a curious addition for a simple biscuit container. Someone brought cold into a very small place, she said quietly, more to herself than to the others. "What's that, Miss Marple?" Inspector Slack demanded. She looked up at him with a mild, inquiring expression. "I was merely observing that the evidence suggests someone introduced an unusual degree of cold into the telephone box. The condensation pattern on the glass, the frost along the base, and now this tin with its curious modifications, they all point to the same conclusion." Lady Bantry shivered, whether from the fog or from some deeper unease. But who would do such a thing? And why? Miss Marple rose and dusted off her gloves with characteristic precision. "Those, my dear Dolly, are exactly the questions we must answer. Though I suspect the why may prove more illuminating than the who, at least initially." Inspector Slack was growing increasingly irritated with what he perceived as mystification. "If you have a theory, Miss Marple, I'd appreciate hearing it in plain English." "Oh, I wouldn't presume to have a theory quite yet, Inspector. But I do have a strong suspicion that Sir Lionel's death, tragic though it certainly is, was not the result of natural causes. Someone took considerable trouble to ensure that he would remain in that telephone box long enough for their plan to take effect." "Murder, you mean?" Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I believe so, yes, though perhaps not in quite the conventional sense. This strikes me as a crime of considerable sophistication, one that required both scientific knowledge and careful planning." As if to underscore her words, a light breeze stirred the fog around them, and from somewhere in the mist came the distant sound of a church bell tolling the half-hour. The investigation, Miss Marple reflected, had only just begun. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Hoarfrost. The morning sun, when it finally broke through the dissipating fog, revealed St. Mary Mead in all its familiar charm. The red telephone box, however, now bore the sobering distinction of being cordoned off with police tape, transforming what had been a cheerful village landmark into something altogether more sinister. Miss Marple arrived at the scene shortly after breakfast, her small wicker basket containing the usual assortment of items that somehow always proved useful during her investigations. She had dressed with particular care in her warmest woolen coat, for the morning air still carried the sharp bite of the previous evening's chill. Inspector Slack was already present, examining the telephone box with the methodical thoroughness that marked his professional approach, however grudging his acceptance of amateur assistance might be. Dr. Haydock stood nearby, reviewing his preliminary notes from the previous evening. "Good morning." "Inspector," Miss Marple called pleasantly, "I do hope you don't mind my returning for another look. I find that daylight often reveals details that artificial illumination can obscure." Slack grunted his acknowledgement, having learned that resistance to Miss Marple's involvement typically proved both futile and counterproductive. "The body's been removed to the mortuary," he informed her. "Dr. Haydock will be conducting a proper post-mortem this afternoon." "Most sensible," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I suspect the external evidence may prove equally revealing." She approached the abandoned biscuit tin first, kneeling beside it with the careful attention of a botanist examining a rare specimen. In the clear morning light, the interior presented a fascinating study in crystalline formations. The entire inner surface was coated with a delicate tracery of white frost, so fine and evenly distributed that it appeared almost artificial in its perfection. "How very curious," she murmured, reaching into her basket for a small magnifying glass. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to observe the felt padding in the lid?" Slack crouched beside her, his expression skeptical but attentive. The felt, which had appeared merely damp in the previous evening's torchlight, now revealed itself to be rigid with frozen moisture. Each fiber stood out clearly, encased in its own minute sheath of ice. "Stiff as a board," Slack observed. "Though I can't say I understand the significance." "Perhaps it will become clearer presently," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. She rose and moved toward the telephone box itself, her sharp eyes scanning the interior floor with methodical precision. Near the base of the structure, almost hidden against the dark metal, lay a small brown moth. Miss Marple pointed it out to Dr. Haydock, who had joined them with professional curiosity. "Dead." "Certainly," the doctor confirmed after a brief examination, though not from any obvious trauma. "No signs of burning or crushing, indeed. And notice, if you will, the complete absence of any soot or scorching on the wings. Whatever killed this creature, it was not flame or heat." Miss Marple reached once again into her basket, this time producing a small box of safety matches. She struck one and held it to ankle height within the telephone box. The flame flared briefly, then began to weaken and gutter despite the absence of any noticeable breeze. "Fascinating," Dr. Haydock observed, his medical training allowing him to appreciate the implications more readily than Inspector Slack. Miss Marple extinguished the dying match and struck another, this time holding it at the level of her face. The flame burned bright and steady, casting dancing shadows on the interior walls of the box. "Oxygen depletion," Dr. Haydock said with growing understanding. "But at such a specific level, that would require something rather more sophisticated than natural causes." Lady Bantry, who had been watching these proceedings with fascination, gave an involuntary shiver. "It's like something from a scientific romance, isn't it? All very mysterious and modern." Miss Marple smiled gently at her friend's comment. "Not so very modern, I'm afraid, Dolly. The principle is quite ancient, though the application may be somewhat novel. One encounters similar phenomena in root cellars during the winter months." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "I recall my dear nephew Raymond once conducting experiments with fruit preservation. He and his school friends discovered that certain gases, being heavier than air, will settle in enclosed spaces. They used the effect to preserve apples in wooden boxes, though I believe their primary interest was in creating a hiding place for their pocket money that their parents couldn't easily access." Inspector Slack's patience with scientific exposition was wearing thin. "All very interesting, Miss Marple, but how does it relate to Sir Lionel's death?" "I believe it relates quite directly, Inspector. If someone introduced a heavy, cold gas into the telephone box, something that would pool at floor level and gradually rise, it would create precisely the conditions we observe. The frost patterns, the dead moth, the way a flame dies at ankle height but burns freely above. Carbon dioxide," Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "Most likely. It's heavier than air, and in sufficient concentration, it would indeed cause asphyxiation. But the quantities required would be considerable, and the delivery method would need to be both efficient and concealed," Miss Marple completed. "Hence, perhaps, our mysterious biscuit tin with its felt lining and curious modifications." She turned her attention back to the tin, examining it from several angles without disturbing its position. The morning light revealed additional details that had been obscured by the previous evening's shadows. The manufacturer's label, while authentic, showed signs of having been removed and reattached. The adhesive beneath appeared fresh, with a slightly tacky quality that suggested recent application. Someone has taken considerable trouble to disguise the true purpose of this container, she observed. The felt lining is not original. It's been added deliberately and with some care. The label has been soaked and repositioned, presumably to conceal evidence of the modifications. Inspector Slack was beginning to show genuine interest despite himself. You're suggesting this tin was used to deliver the gas that killed Sir Lionel? I'm suggesting it's a very real possibility. Inspector, though the exact mechanism remains to be determined. Lady Bantry, who had been following the technical discussion with some difficulty, ventured a more practical question. But who would know about such things? It sounds frightfully complicated. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Not as complicated as one might suppose, Dolly. Anyone with a basic understanding of chemistry or even household science might grasp the principle. The challenge would be in the execution, and more particularly in obtaining the necessary materials without arousing suspicion. She paused, her gaze moving thoughtfully around the village green. Through the morning mist, various figures could be seen going about their daily business. The postwoman making her rounds, shopkeepers preparing for the day's trade, and the inevitable cluster of curious villagers drawn by the unusual activity around the telephone box. I think, Miss Marple said presently, we shall need to learn a great deal more about Sir Lionel's recent activities and associations. A crime of this sophistication suggests both considerable planning and a very specific motive. Inspector Slack, whose natural inclination toward foreign conspiracy theories had been somewhat dampened by Miss Marple's scientific explanations, found his suspicions reigniting. You mean all that Whitehall business? Perhaps. Though I suspect the truth may prove both more personal and more tragic than international espionage would suggest. As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the morning mist, a pale, neatly dressed woman, walking with the purposeful stride of someone on an important errand. Miss Marple watched her approach with a quiet attention she reserved for potentially significant observations. The investigation, she reflected, was about to enter a new phase. Chapter 4. Biscuit Tin. Not biscuits. The morning's investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Nora Pike, the village postmistress, whose round face bore an expression of considerable distress. She approached the small group gathered around the telephone box with the determined air of someone who possessed information that simply could not wait. "Inspector Slack," she called breathlessly, her usually immaculate hair showing signs of hasty arrangement. "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion. But there's something I feel I must tell you about yesterday evening." Inspector Slack, recognizing the potential value of eyewitness testimony, immediately gave her his full attention. "What time would this concern, Mrs. Pike?" "Just before closing time at the post office, 8:40. It was, precisely. Sir Lionel came in wanting to purchase trunk call coins for the telephone box. He was most particular about it. Said he needed exactly 2 sixpences for an important call." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. The timing corresponded perfectly with what they had established about Sir Lionel's mysterious appointment. "And did you accommodate his request?" "Indeed I did, though they were the very last 2 coins of that denomination I had in the till. I remember thinking it odd at the time. Sir Lionel usually conducted his business from his own telephone, but he explained that his line was temporarily out of order." Mrs. Pike paused, wringing her hands nervously. "There's something else, Inspector. When I examined the telephone box this morning, purely out of curiosity, you understand? I noticed that the coin slot appears to be quite jammed. The mechanism won't accept coins at all." This detail sent Inspector Slack hurrying to examine the telephone box more closely. Indeed, the coin slot showed clear signs of obstruction, with what appeared to be a sticky, translucent substance coating the edges. "Gum, perhaps?" Dr. Haydock suggested, leaning in for a better look. Miss Marple produced her magnifying glass once more, studying the substance with careful attention. "Not gum, I believe, something rather more sophisticated." She sniffed delicately. There's a faint but distinctive scent. Sweet, with floral undertones. Eau de cologne, I should say, mixed with something waxy. The implications of this discovery were becoming increasingly clear. If the coin slot had been deliberately blocked, Sir Lionel would have found himself unable to complete his call in the normal fashion. The line would have remained open, keeping him trapped in the telephone box, while whatever diabolical mechanism had been prepared took its deadly effect. It was at this moment that Mr. Rook appeared on the scene, drawn by the unusual activity like many of the villagers that morning. He was a weather-beaten man in his 50s, with a slightly theatrical air common to those in the entertainment business. His painted van parked nearby bore the legend, Rook Traveling Pictures and Theatrical Effects. "Terrible business about Sir Lionel," he observed, removing his cap respectfully. "Fine gentleman, always had a kind word for working folk." Lady Bantry, ever sociable, engaged him in conversation about his profession. "How fascinating your work must be, Mr. Rook, all those clever effects for the local productions." "I've been doing it for 20 years now. Magic lantern shows, fog effects for the Christmas pantomimes, that sort of thing. Got all manner of tricks in the van." Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. "Fog effects, you say? How very ingenious. Might I ask what method you employ?" Mr. Rook's face brightened with professional pride. "Dry ice, mostly. Solid carbon dioxide, frozen hard as rock. You put it in a special container with a bit of warm water and felt padding, and it makes the most marvelous fog you ever did see. Completely harmless, of course, though you wouldn't want to breathe too much of it in a closed space." The significance of this revelation was not lost on anyone present. Dr. Haydock stepped forward with renewed interest. "This dry ice of yours, would it be capable of producing the effects we observed in the telephone box?" "Oh, certainly, sir. Heavy as anything. Carbon dioxide gas sinks right to the floor and stays there. I've seen it used for all sorts of purposes." Mr. Rook paused, then added with a slight flush of embarrassment, "Though I must say, if you were a brute about it, you could stun rats with the stuff. Not that I'd ever do such a thing, mind you, but I've heard tell of it being used that way." Inspector Slack's notebook was working overtime. "This dry ice? Where does one obtain such a substance?" "Oh, any fishmonger worth his salt keeps it for preserving the catch, especially in winter. Young Davy Keel over in Much Benham, he's always got a supply. Brings it around regular like for the fancy restaurants and such." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Mr. Davy Keel himself appeared, pushing a handcart loaded with the day's fresh fish. He was a sturdy young man with a perpetually damp appearance of his trade, his canvas apron bearing the inevitable stains of his profession. "Morning, all," he called cheerfully, though his expression sobered when he noticed the police tape around the telephone box. "Heard about poor Sir Lionel. Shocking business." Inspector Slack wasted no time in questioning him about his dry ice supplies. Keel readily admitted to making regular deliveries throughout the area. "I keep plenty of the stuff. Never know when someone might need it. Just yesterday, as it happens, I dropped off a good bit at the Blue Boar for their cold storage. Left some extra chunks lying about, too. The landlord said he might use them for some special puddings he was planning." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "And did anyone else request dry ice yesterday, Mr. Keel?" The fishmonger scratched his head thoughtfully. "Well, now that you mention it, there was that foreign gentleman staying at the Blue Boar. Pale fellow, very polite. Asked for about half a pound. Said he needed it for medicinal compresses. Seemed an odd use for it, but then foreigners have their own ways, don't they?" "This would be Mr. Novak, I presume?" Miss Marple inquired. "That's the one. Paid cash, no questions asked. Said his papers were all in order when I mentioned it seemed an unusual request." Inspector Slack's conspiracy theories were evidently reasserting themselves. "Foreign agents," he muttered darkly. "I knew it from the start." However, Miss Marple appeared less convinced by this obvious suspect. She had noticed Mr. Rook examining his van with some concern during the conversation about dry ice. "Is something troubling you, Mr. Rook?" she asked gently. The picture man shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's probably nothing, but I like to keep my equipment secure, you understand? Competition in this business and all that. Let me just check my fog box is still properly locked." He moved to the rear of his van and opened the doors, revealing an impressive array of theatrical equipment. Among the magic lantern slides and painted screens sat a black metal box similar in size to the abandoned biscuit tin. Mr. Rook examined it carefully, checking the felt-lined interior and the intact manufacturer's seal. "All present and correct," he announced with visible relief. "Though I must say the felt lining in my box looks remarkably similar to what I observed in that tin of yours, Miss Marple. Same weave, same age by the look of it." This observation prompted a closer examination of Mr. Keel's fish cart. Among his wrapping papers, mostly brown craft paper of various sizes, several showed distinctive circular water stains approximately the size of the mysterious biscuit tin's base. The web of evidence was becoming increasingly complex, with multiple individuals having access to both the means and materials necessary for the crime. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying not just the obvious suspects, but the seemingly innocent bystanders who had gathered to observe the investigation. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we shall need to cast our net rather more widely than initially anticipated. This crime required not only technical knowledge and special materials, but also intimate familiarity with Sir Lionel's habits and the geography of our little village." As if to emphasize her point, the church bell chimed the hour, its sound carrying clearly across the green where so many of St. Mary Mead's residents had now gathered, drawn by curiosity about the tragedy that had befallen their quiet community. Chapter 5. Psalm Numbers in the Margin. The afternoon brought with it a subtle shift in the investigation's direction, precipitated by an observation from the Reverend Leonard Clement, who had been quietly watching the proceedings from the vicarage doorstep. His tall, scholarly figure approached the group with a measured gait of a man accustomed to bearing the weight of parish concerns. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful cadence that marked his sermons, "I wonder if I might have a word. There was something rather peculiar that occurred yesterday evening, around the time of Sir Lionel's unfortunate appointment." The assembled company turned their attention to the vicar, who seemed momentarily uncomfortable at finding himself the center of such focused interest. "Please continue." "Vicar," Miss Marple encouraged gently, "well, it was just before 9 when I discovered a small piece of paper had been pushed through our letter slot. Most unusual for that time of evening, you understand. It contained nothing more than a biblical reference. Psalm 7:16, written in a rather neat hand." Inspector Slack frowned. "And you found this significant?" "Not initially, no. But upon reflection, the timing seemed rather coincidental. And there was something about the paper itself that struck me as familiar, though I couldn't quite place it." Miss Marple's interest was immediately aroused. "Might we examine this paper, Vicar?" "Certainly. I believe I left it on my study desk." The small procession made its way to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement produced the slip of paper in question. It was of good quality, cream-colored, and cut with evident precision. The biblical reference was written in a careful copperplate hand that spoke of education and deliberate practice. "Psalm 7:16, Miss Marple murmured, opening the large parish Bible that rested on the vicar's reading stand. "His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate." Lady Bantry suppressed a small shiver. "Rather ominous, isn't it?" Miss Marple continued her examination of the Bible, her sharp eyes noting various pencil marks in the margins. Many appeared to be cross-references in different hands, accumulated over years of parish Bible study groups. "Vicar," she said presently, who typically prepares the scriptural references for your study circles. Miss Margaret Phelps, our parish typist, a most conscientious lady. She's been handling the administrative duties for our Bible study group for several years now. War widow, you know. Lost her young man during the conflict. Miss Marple's attention had focused on a series of small pencil marks beside several psalm numbers. Unlike the other marginalia, these appeared fresh and deliberately placed. Psalm 7:16 was indeed marked, but so were two others, Psalm 55:14 and Psalm 109:8. How curious, she observed, turning to these additional references. Psalm 55:14, we took sweet counsel together and walked unto the house of God in company. And Psalm 109:8, let his days be few, and let another take his office. Dr. Haydock, who had accompanied them to the vicarage, studied the verses with growing unease. Taken together, they paint a rather dark picture, don't they? Betrayal by a trusted companion, divine retribution, and replacement of the fallen. What particularly caught Miss Marple's attention was the method by which the psalm numbers had been marked. Each reference was accompanied by tiny perforations in the paper, as though someone had used a fine needle to mark the locations through overlaid slips of paper before adding the pencil notations. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, I believe we should speak with Miss Phelps. These markings suggest a degree of premeditation that extends well beyond the immediate circumstances of Sir Lionel's death. The search for Miss Margaret Phelps proved straightforward. She resided in a neat cottage on the far side of the village green, within easy walking distance of both the church and the telephone box. The cottage itself reflected its occupant's character, tidy, modest, and maintained with the careful attention of someone for whom order provided necessary comfort. Miss Phelps herself proved to be a woman of perhaps 45, with prematurely gray hair and a careful demeanor often found in those who have learned to navigate life's disappointments with quiet dignity. She received her visitors with polite attention, though Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in the hands that served tea from an old but well-maintained service. Such terrible tragedy about Sir Lionel, Miss Phelps observed, her voice carrying the measured tones of practiced condolence. The village feels quite unsettled by it all. Inspector Slack wasted little time on pleasantries. Miss Phelps, we understand you prepare the biblical references for the parish study group. Indeed, I do, Inspector. It's one of my small contributions to the community. I find the work quite absorbing. Miss Marple examined the sitting room with her customary thoroughness. Everything spoke of careful economy and maintained gentility, the sort of environment created by someone determined to preserve dignity despite reduced circumstances. On a small table near the window sat a mending basket, its contents neatly organized with the precision of long habit. The psalm references we found marked in the parish Bible, Miss Marple said gently. They form quite a specific theme, don't they? Miss Phelps set down her teacup with deliberate care. I always try to select passages that speak to our current circumstances, Miss Marple. The congregation appreciates relevance in their studies. Of course, though these particular verses seem rather more pointed than usual. Betrayal, retribution, replacement, themes that might resonate particularly with someone who has experienced significant loss. The color drained slightly from Miss Phelps's already pale complexion. I'm sure I don't understand your meaning. Miss Marple's gaze had settled on the mending basket where something had caught her attention. Among the spools of thread and darning wool lay a small circle of felt, darkened with moisture and bearing traces of what appeared to be the same crystalline deposit they had observed in the mysterious biscuit tin. Miss Phelps, she said with gentle persistence, I wonder if you might tell us about your late fiancé. The Reverend mentioned you were widowed during the war. The question struck home with visible effect. Miss Phelps's hands clenched involuntarily, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quality of suppressed pain that years had not entirely healed. Kenneth Ray was his name. We were to be married in the summer of 1942. He was a wireless operator, very skilled, very dedicated to his duty, and he was lost overseas. In Berlin, 1947, long after the war officially ended. The words came slowly, as though each one required deliberate effort. There were complications, intelligence work, they said, things that couldn't be fully explained to families. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. Such losses are particularly difficult when the circumstances remain unclear. Ken was betrayed, Miss Phelps said suddenly, her composure cracking slightly. Someone in London spoke carelessly, and the information found its way to the wrong ears. He was captured, tried, and executed. The official letter was quite explicit about that much, at least. Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed interest. And did you ever learn the identity of the person responsible for this carelessness? Miss Phelps's silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had regained its careful control. One hears rumors, Inspector. In government circles, indiscretions have consequences. Sometimes those consequences extend far beyond the immediate participants. As if drawn by some instinct, Miss Marple's attention returned to the mending basket. Beside the felt circle lay what appeared to be the back of a product label, its surface damp and showing the telltale bloom of dried adhesive. The connection to the reattached label on the biscuit tin was unmistakable. The afternoon light, streaming through Miss Phelps's neat curtains, suddenly seemed to carry a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather outside. Chapter 6. The Ice from the Y. Fishmonger, the discovery of the felt. Circle and label remnant in Miss Phelps's mending. Basket had cast a decidedly different light upon the investigation. Inspector Slack, never one to delay action once a potential culprit had been identified, was all for immediate arrest. Miss Marple, however, counseled a more cautious approach. Evidence, Inspector, is rather like a tapestry, she observed as they walked back toward the village green. One or two threads may suggest a pattern, but it is only when the entire weaving is complete that one can be certain of the design. Slack's response was characteristically blunt. Seems clear enough to me. The woman had motive, means, and opportunity. Her fiancé was betrayed by someone in government circles, and Sir Lionel fits the bill perfectly. Perhaps. But I think we should speak with Mr. Keel once more before drawing any final conclusions. There are still several loose threads that require attention. They found Davy Keel at the Blue Boar, where he was making his afternoon delivery of fresh fish. The inn's kitchen courtyard bustled with activity, as the cook examined the day's catch and haggled good-naturedly over prices. Keel himself appeared somewhat nervous when Inspector Slack approached. Wiping his hands repeatedly on his already damp apron. Mr. Keel, Slack began without preamble, we need to discuss your dry ice deliveries in greater detail. Specifically, we want to know about every piece you distributed yesterday. The fishmonger's face grew troubled. Well, there was the regular delivery to the Blue Boar, as I mentioned, about $10 worth for their cold storage. Then that foreign gentleman, Mr. Novak, he wanted half a pound for his medical purposes. And that accounts for all of it. Keel hesitated, then shook his head reluctantly. Not quite all, Inspector. I had some smaller pieces left over from cutting the main blocks. Nothing substantial, mind you, just slivers and chips. The landlord here said he might have used them for some fancy puddings he was planning, so I left them in the courtyard. Miss Marple stepped forward. These leftover pieces, they would have been accessible to anyone who knew they were there. Oh, certainly. I just left them on the stone table by the kitchen door. Anyone could have helped themselves, though I can't imagine why they'd want to. At this moment, Mr. Novak himself appeared from the inn's interior. He was indeed a pale man, as Keel described, with the careful bearing of someone perpetually conscious of being a foreigner in a small English village. His English was precise but heavily accented, and he seemed genuinely distressed by the suggestion that his purchase might be connected to Sir Lionel's death. I assure you, officers, my need for the ice was entirely legitimate. I suffer from a circulation condition that requires cold compresses. My physician in Prague recommended the treatment specifically. Inspector Slack's suspicions were not so easily allayed. And where is this ice now, Mr. Novak? The man's face fell slightly. I am afraid it has already been used. The treatment requires that the ice be applied while still in solid form. By this morning, what remained had sublimated entirely. Convenient, Slack muttered. But Miss Marple was studying Mr. Novak with a different sort of attention. The handling of dry ice, she said conversationally, requires considerable care, does it not? I believe it can cause severe burns if touched directly. Indeed, madam, most painful. I learned this to my cost during my first attempt at the treatment. See here. He extended his hands, showing several angry red marks on his palms and fingertips. One must use proper tools or thick gloves. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The burns were consistent with recent mishandling of dry ice, but they also suggested someone inexperienced with the substance. The careful preparation of the biscuit tin device would have required considerable expertise and, more importantly, the ability to handle the material without injury. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Rook, who approached them with evident agitation. Inspector Slack, I've been thinking about our discussion earlier, about the dry ice and theatrical effects. There's something I should mention, yes? Well, it's about my equipment. I said it was all secured properly, but I've been checking more carefully. Someone has definitely been at my van. This revelation sent the entire group to examine Mr. Rook's vehicle more closely. The traveling picture man pointed out subtle signs of tampering, scratches around the lock, a slight displacement of equipment inside, and most tellingly, a small wet circle on the floor where none should have been. My fog box hasn't been taken, he explained, but it's definitely been examined. Someone who knew what they were looking for took a good look at how it was constructed. Miss Marple crouched beside the van, studying the wet mark with a magnifying glass. The same circular pattern we observed on Mr. Keel's wrapping papers. Someone has been conducting a thorough study of dry ice containers and their construction. But the lock wasn't broken, Dr. Haydock observed. Whoever did this had either considerable skill or a key, Miss Marple completed. Mr. Rook, who else might have access to your equipment? The picture man scratched his head uncomfortably. Well, I do leave a spare key with various reliable folks around the villages I visit. In case of emergency, you understand? Mrs. Pike has one, and the vicar. And he paused, his expression growing more troubled. Miss Phelps has one, too. She sometimes helps with the arrangements for our parish entertainments. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident. There we have it, then. Means, motive, opportunity, and now access to the technical knowledge required. But Miss Marple was not yet ready to close the case. Something about the sequence of evidence troubled her, though she could not yet articulate what it was. The physical clues all pointed in one direction, yet her instinct suggested a more complex picture. Inspector, she said carefully, might I suggest we examine Mr. Rook's fog box more closely, and perhaps compare its construction with the biscuit tin we discovered? The comparison proved illuminating. The theatrical fog box was indeed lined with felt of identical weave and apparent age to that found in the murder weapon. More significantly, when they examined the manufacturer's label on Rook's equipment, they discovered it bore the same slightly tacky residue around the edges that they had observed on the biscuit tin. Someone practiced, as Marple observed quietly. They studied your equipment carefully, Mr. Rook, learned how it worked, then created their own version using a more readily available container. But that still points to Miss Phelps, Inspector Slack insisted. She had access to the equipment. The dry ice was available, and she had every reason to want Sir Lionel dead. Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. Yes, Inspector. The evidence is quite compelling. Yet I find myself wondering about the timing of certain elements. The psalm reference delivered to the vicarage, for instance, and the precise coordination required to ensure Sir Lionel would be trapped in that telephone box at exactly the right moment. As if summoned by her words, the church bell began to toll the evening hour, its bronze voice carrying clearly across the village green, where so much drama had unfolded in such a short time. The investigation was approaching its climax, but Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations were yet to come. Chapter 7. Wax on the Coin Slot. The evening shadows were lengthening across St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple made her request to examine the telephone box's coin mechanism more thoroughly. Inspector Slack, eager to build his case against Miss Phelps, was initially reluctant to delay proceedings for what he considered unnecessary detail work. The woman's practically confessed, he grumbled. All this fussing about with technical matters seems rather beside the point. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied mildly. But I find that in cases of premeditated murder, the devil is very often in the details. And there are still several aspects of this crime that require clarification. Dr. Haydock, whose scientific training had made him increasingly interested in the technical aspects of the case, supported Miss Marple's request. The mechanism by which Sir Lionel was kept in the telephone box is crucial to understanding the full scope of the crime. I think we should examine it properly. Mrs. Pike, who had remained nearby throughout the afternoon's investigations, produced the key to the telephone box's coin drawer with the efficiency that marked all her postal duties. The drawer itself was a simple metal compartment, designed to collect the coins that patrons deposited for their calls. The 2 sixpences Sir Lionel purchased should be in here, she observed, sliding the drawer open, though I noticed earlier that the slot mechanism seemed quite jammed. The drawer proved to be empty of the expected coins, but it revealed something far more interesting. Around the interior edges of the coin slot mechanism, there remained traces of a waxy substance that had hardened into thin, translucent ribbons. The material caught the light with an oily sheen, and when Miss Marple examined it closely, she detected the same faint floral scent they had noticed earlier. Eau de cologne mixed with household wax, she observed, carefully scraping a small sample onto a handkerchief. Applied while warm and soft, I should think, then allowed to harden in position. Lady Bantry, who had been following the technical discussion with some difficulty, ventured a practical question. But what would be the purpose of blocking the coin slot? Miss Marple straightened, her expression brightening with the satisfaction of understanding. To keep the telephone line open, my dear Dolly. If Sir Lionel's coins could not drop properly into the mechanism, the call would not register as completed. The line to Berlin would remain connected, holding him in the box while he waited for the connection to clear. Inspector Slack grudgingly admitted the cleverness of the arrangement. So whoever did this could control exactly how long Sir Lionel remained trapped, long enough for the gas to do its work. Precisely. Though the timing would have required considerable precision. Too little time, and Sir Lionel might have abandoned the call and left the box. Too much time, and someone might have noticed the prolonged occupation and come to investigate. Dr. Haydock was studying the waxy residue with professional interest. This mixture would have been quite effective. The wax provides structure and adhesion, while the cologne would have kept it workable during application. Whoever prepared this had a good understanding of both chemistry and practical mechanics. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, it suggests someone with domestic experience, as well as technical knowledge, the sort of person who might use such materials in everyday household tasks. Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Frances Alder, Sir Lionel's secretary housekeeper, She approached the group with the dignified bearing that had served her well in government circles, though her usual composure showed signs of strain. "Inspector Slack," she said formally, "I felt I should inform you of certain matters concerning Sir Lionel's recent correspondence. There were aspects of his recent behavior that may bear upon your investigation." Slack gestured for her to continue, his notebook at the ready. "Last week, Sir Lionel received a letter that caused him considerable distress. He read it several times before burning it in the study fireplace, which was most unusual for him. He was typically quite methodical about his correspondence. Did you observe any details about this letter, Mrs. Alder?" "Only that it appeared to be written on foreign paper, thin and grayish, the sort used in continental Europe, and that it prompted Sir Lionel to make several telephone inquiries to former colleagues in London." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Did he mention the substance of these inquiries?" Mrs. Alder hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her employer and the demands of the investigation. "He spoke of checking records from 1947, something about a wireless operator who had been captured in Berlin. Sir Lionel seemed to feel that certain information from that time might be coming to light. The significance of this revelation was not lost on anyone present. It provided a direct connection between Sir Lionel's recent activities and the tragedy that had befallen Kenneth Ray 8 years earlier." "There's something else," Mrs. Alder continued reluctantly. "Yesterday evening, just before Sir Lionel left for his appointment, I observed Miss Phelps near the vicarage. She appeared to be posting something through the letter slot. The timing struck me as unusual, given that it was well past normal calling hours." Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident. "What time would this have been?" "Approximately 8:50, I should say. I just finished clearing Sir Lionel's tea service when I noticed her through the study window." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention she reserved for crucial details. The timing placed Miss Phelps at the vicarage just as Sir Lionel would have been entering the telephone box. It suggested a degree of coordination that spoke to careful planning. "Mrs. Alder," she said gently, "you mentioned that Sir Lionel seemed troubled by his correspondence. Did he give any indication of expecting danger?" "Not danger exactly. But he did mention that certain actions from the past sometimes had longer consequences than one might expect. He said that in his line of work, one learned to be prepared for unexpected developments." Dr. Haydock had returned his attention to the coin slot mechanism, using a small torch to examine the interior more closely. "There's something else here," he announced. "The surface of the slot itself has been treated with some sort of lubricant, something slippery that would prevent the coins from finding proper purchase." Miss Marple examined the substance he indicated. "Soap, I believe. Ordinary household soap, applied with care to ensure the coins would slide rather than grip." The picture that was emerging showed a crime of remarkable sophistication. The perpetrator had not only understood the technical requirements of the murder method, but had also anticipated and addressed every practical obstacle to its execution. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to understand how this crime was committed. The question that remains is whether we have correctly identified who committed it." Slack frowned at this distinction. "The evidence against Miss Phelps seems overwhelming." "Indeed it does, almost too overwhelming, one might say. But before we proceed to an arrest, I think there are 1 or 2 additional inquiries we should make." As if to underscore the gravity of the moment, the church clock began to strike the hour, its measured tones carrying across the village green, where the red telephone box stood in silent testimony to the deadly ingenuity of human malice. Chapter 8. The Watch with 2 Times. The following morning brought a development that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the previous evening's tragedy. Dr. Haydock arrived at the village green carrying a small manila envelope, his expression grave with the weight of official findings. "The post-mortem results," he announced to the assembled group. "Death by asphyxiation, as we suspected. But there's something else that I think you should see." He produced Sir Lionel's gold pocket watch, a handsome timepiece that had clearly been well maintained over many years. The watch face showed the time as 8:45, its hands frozen in their final position when the mechanism had ceased functioning. "The mainspring is quite old," Dr. Haydock explained. "Under stress, it appears to have snapped, stopping the watch at the precise moment he collapsed. But that's not the most interesting discovery." He opened the watch case to reveal the interior mechanism, and there, tucked beneath the works, was a small piece of paper covered with Sir Lionel's careful handwriting. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles to read the notation aloud. 8:57, 3 pips, Crottensburg. She looked up thoughtfully. "That would be a district of Berlin, would it not?" "Indeed," confirmed Mrs. Alder, who had joined them to provide what assistance she could. Sir Lionel was quite familiar with Berlin's geography from his government service. Crottensburg was where many of the post-war intelligence operations were centered. Inspector Slack studied the notation with growing interest. So Sir Lionel was expecting this call to last 12 minutes, from 8:45 until 8:57, when he heard the 3 pips indicating additional payment was required. "But he never heard those pips," Miss Marple observed quietly. "The call was terminated by other means well before that time." Dr. Haydock nodded solemnly. "Based on the physical evidence, I estimate Sir Lionel lost consciousness approximately 8 to 10 minutes after entering the telephone box. The carbon dioxide concentration would have reached dangerous levels quite rapidly in such a confined space." The implications of this timing became increasingly clear as they considered the sequence of events. Someone had known precisely how long Sir Lionel's call was scheduled to last, and had timed their murderous device accordingly. "Mrs. Alder," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned seeing Miss Phelps at the vicarage at approximately 8:50. Given that Sir Lionel would have been unconscious by then, her delivery of the psalm reference seems almost theatrical in its timing." Mrs. Alder nodded reluctantly. "It did strike me as odd behavior." Miss Phelps appeared quite agitated, not her usual composed self at all. She kept looking back toward the telephone box as she walked away. Inspector Slack was growing impatient with what he saw as unnecessary complications. The woman's guilt is clear enough. She had motive, means, and opportunity. All this business about timing merely confirms her careful planning. But Miss Marple was studying Sir Lionel's notebook, which Dr. Haydock had also retrieved from the deceased man's effects. The final entries painted a picture of mounting concern about past decisions coming back to demand accountability. "Listen to this," she said, reading from the last complete entry. "Klaus writes that London runner was careless in 47. Courier paid the price on Crottensburg gallows. Time to settle accounts," he says. But which accounts? And settled? How? Lady Bantry shivered at the ominous tone of the writing. "It sounds as though Sir Lionel knew he was in danger. Or thought he was," Miss Marple corrected carefully. "There's an important distinction. Sir Lionel believed the threat was coming from Klaus Hoffmann in Berlin. But what if the real danger was much closer to home?" She paused, her attention caught by another entry in the notebook, this one from several days earlier. "Here he's made a list of local residents who might have had connections to wartime intelligence work. The vicar is mentioned due to his university languages degree. Mr. Rook because of his travels with the entertainment circuit. And," she stopped, her expression growing more serious. "Yes?" Inspector Slack prompted impatiently. "Miss Phelps is listed as well, but not for any suspicious reasons. Sir Lionel has noted that she was the fiancée of Kenneth Ray, and that she might be a source of information about his final assignment." The revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light. Rather than being viewed as a potential threat, Miss Phelps had been considered by Sir Lionel as someone who might be able to help clarify the circumstances of her fiancé's death. Mrs. Alder confirmed this interpretation. Sir Lionel mentioned speaking with Miss Phelps about Kenneth Ray. He felt she deserved to know the full truth about what had happened in Berlin. He was preparing to share certain classified information that had recently been declassified. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone assembling a complex puzzle. So, Sir Lionel was planning to tell Miss Phelps what really happened to her fiancé, information that might have provided closure after years of uncertainty. That would hardly give her reason to murder him, Dr. Haydock observed. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. Unless the information Sir Lionel planned to share was not what Miss Phelps wanted to hear. She turned to a fresh page in her own notebook and began sketching a timeline of the previous evening's events. The precision required for the crime was becoming increasingly apparent. Not just technical precision, but temporal precision as well. Consider the sequence, she said, addressing the group. Sir Lionel purchases his coins at 8:40 and proceeds to the telephone box at 8:45. By 8:57, according to his own calculations, he should have heard the 3 pips indicating his billing call was ending. But Miss Phelps was observed delivering her psalm reference to the vicarage at 8:50, well before Sir Lionel would have expected his call to conclude. Inspector Slack frowned. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Miss Phelps knew exactly when that telephone call would end, despite not being party to the arrangements between Sir Lionel and his Berlin correspondent. She knew because she had access to information that allowed her to calculate the timing precisely. Lady Bantry looked confused. But how could she possibly know such a thing? Miss Marple's expression grew more grave. Because, my dear Dolly, she had been in communication with Klaus Hoffmann herself. She knew about the call because she had helped arrange it. The implications of this revelation began to settle over the group like the fog that had shrouded the village the previous evening. If Miss Marple was correct, then Miss Phelps had not simply seized upon an opportunity for revenge. She had created that opportunity with meticulous care and deadly intent. Chapter 9. The Name Crossed Out. Missy. Marple's suggestion that Miss Phelps might have been in communication with Klaus Hoffmann prompted an immediate investigation of the parish records. The Reverend Clement, though somewhat reluctant to expose private church documents to secular scrutiny, recognized the gravity of the situation and agreed to assist. I maintained comprehensive records of all parish members and their life events, he explained as he led them to the vestry where the filing cabinets were kept, engagements, marriages, departures, and unfortunately deaths. It's all documented with the thoroughness that church administration requires. The filing system proved to be meticulously organized, with separate sections for different years and categories of records. Miss Marple found herself particularly interested in the wartime period, when so many young lives had been disrupted by the demands of military service. Here, the vicar said, producing a leather-bound volume labeled Parish Register, 1940 to 1950. He opened it to the section covering 1941, running his finger down the entries until he found the relevant notation. Margaret Phelps engaged to Kenneth Ray, wireless operator, October 1941. Wedding planned for summer 1942. The entry was written in the vicar's careful hand, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was a subsequent modification. In 1947, Kenneth Ray's name had been struck through with a pencil line, and beside it was marked a small X in what appeared to be the same pencil. That marking, Miss Marple inquired, is that your usual notation for deaths? Reverend Clement examined the mark more closely. Yes, though typically I use it only when we receive official confirmation. In Mr. Ray's case, the notification came through government channels rather than military ones. Quite unusual, actually. Most war deaths were processed through standard military records. Lady Bantry, who'd been examining other entries in the register, made a discovery that sent a chill through the assembled group. "Jane, look at this. There's a separate file of correspondence here, and some of these letters are on that thin grayish paper Mrs. Alder mentioned." The letters in question were indeed written on foreign paper, and their contents proved to be both illuminating and deeply troubling. The earliest was dated 1947, shortly after Kenneth Ray's execution, and was addressed to Miss Phelps. It was signed with the initial K and bore a Berlin postmark. Miss Marple read the letter carefully, her expression growing more grave with each line. "This Klaus Hoffmann has been corresponding with Miss Phelps for years. He's been feeding her information about Kenneth's death, but information that appears to be carefully selected and presented." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "What sort of information?" "The kind designed to nurture resentment and desire for revenge. Hoffmann has convinced Miss Phelps that Kenneth's capture was the direct result of careless talk by a specific individual in London, someone who revealed operational details that should have remained secret." Dr. Haydock studied the letters with professional interest in their psychological impact. Classic manipulation. Feed the victim just enough truth to make the lies believable, then gradually direct their anger toward a predetermined target. Mrs. Alder, who had been listening with growing distress, finally spoke. "So Sir Lionel did mention that he'd been involved in reviewing some of the Berlin operations from 1947. He said there had been security breaches that resulted in casualties. He felt responsible even though he was following orders." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Sir Lionel was indeed involved in the operation that led to Kenneth Ray's capture, but not in the way Hoffmann suggested to Miss Phelps. According to these government files that Sir Lionel was preparing to share with her, he was actually investigating the security breach that had compromised her fiancé." She produced another document from the church files, a faded telegram that had been filed with a death notification. "This is the official communication about Kenneth's execution. But notice the date. It arrived 3 days before Sir Lionel received his own orders to investigate the security breach." The implications were staggering. Sir Lionel had not caused Kenneth's death. He had been assigned to find out who had. "The cruel irony," Miss Marple observed quietly, "is that Sir Lionel's investigation might eventually have identified the real traitor. Miss Phelps murdered the one person who was actually working to clear her fiancé's name and bring the true culprit to justice." Inspector Slack was studying the correspondence with renewed interest. "But why would this Hoffmann fellow want Sir Lionel dead? What was his motive?" Miss Marple turned to the most recent letter in the collection, dated just 2 weeks prior to Sir Lionel's death. "Because Klaus Hoffmann was the security breach. He was a double agent who had been feeding information to the Soviets. Kenneth Ray discovered this, and Hoffmann arranged for his elimination by having him falsely accused of being the traitor." The letter itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It informed Miss Phelps that Sir Lionel was planning to publish a memoir that would place all blame for Kenneth's death on the young wireless operator himself, portraying him as an incompetent who had compromised his own mission. Completely false, of course, Miss Marple noted. Sir Lionel's actual plans were to reveal the truth about Kenneth's heroism and Hoffmann's treachery, but Miss Phelps had no way of knowing that. Lady Bantry shook her head in dismay. So this Hoffmann convinced the poor woman to murder the one person who might have vindicated her fiancé's memory. Precisely. And in the process eliminated the primary threat to his own continued safety. Sir Lionel's investigation was getting dangerously close to exposing Hoffmann's wartime activities. Dr. Haydock examined Miss Phelps's mending basket more carefully, using the magnifying glass Miss Marple had provided. The felt circle we found matches the lining from the biscuit tin exactly, and this label backing is definitely from a Huntley & Palmer container. The adhesive is still damp, Miss Marple nodded. She kept souvenirs of her work, perhaps as evidence of her devotion to Kenneth's memory, or perhaps because she couldn't quite believe what she had done. They made one final discovery in Miss Phelps's cottage, a small bottle of eau de cologne on her hall table, positioned where visitors would notice it immediately upon entering. The bottle was nearly empty, and traces of the same waxy substance they had found in the telephone box coin slot could be detected around its cap. She used her own cologne to thin the wax, Miss Marple observed. A domestic solution to a technical problem, the sort of adaptation that speaks to considerable ingenuity under pressure. Inspector Slack was finally ready to make his arrest, but Miss Marple counseled one final precaution. "Inspector, I think we should approach this with great care. Miss Phelps believed she was avenging a terrible injustice. When she learns the truth about what she has actually done, the psychological shock may be considerable." As if summoned by their discussion, Miss Phelps herself appeared at her cottage gate, returning from her morning walk. She saw the assembled group and approached with the calm dignity that had characterized her throughout the investigation. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I trust your inquiries are progressing satisfactorily." Miss Marple looked at this woman who had committed such an elaborate murder in the service of what she believed to be justice, and felt a profound sadness for the tragedy that human manipulation could create. The moment of truth had arrived. Chapter 10. At the Red Box. Cold air, cold motive. Miss Phelps stood at her garden gate with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the investigation. Though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected subtle signs of strain, a slight tremor in the hands, a careful control of breathing that suggested considerable tension. "Miss Phelps," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might spare us a few moments for a final demonstration. Inspector Slack has asked me to explain exactly how Sir Lionel met his death, and I believe you may be able to assist us with certain technical details." The request seemed innocent enough, and Miss Phelps nodded with apparent calm. "Certainly, Miss Marple. I shall be happy to help in any way I can." They walked together to the telephone box, now cleared of its police tape but still bearing the invisible weight of the tragedy that had occurred within its red-painted walls. Miss Marple had asked Dr. Haydock to bring certain materials, a small quantity of dry ice obtained from Mr. Keel, and a reproduction of the biscuit tin device based on their analysis of the evidence. "The method," Miss Marple began, addressing the small group that had gathered, "was both ingenious and terrible in its simplicity. The murderer understood that Sir Lionel would be expecting a telephone call at a specific time, and would remain in the box until that call was completed." She indicated the demonstration tin, which Dr. Haydock had prepared according to their specifications, a biscuit tin lined with felt to prevent noise and to slow the sublimation of dry ice. The felt also created an insulated chamber that would maintain the solid carbon dioxide for longer than would otherwise be possible. Inspector Slack watched as Dr. Haydock carefully positioned the tin beneath the telephone shelf, using a small amount of soap to ensure it slid silently into place. The soap prevented any scraping sound that might have alerted Sir Lionel to what was happening. Miss Marple continued her explanation with the methodical precision of a scientist describing an experiment. Carbon dioxide gas is heavier than air. As the dry ice sublimates, the gas would pool at the floor level of the telephone box and gradually rise. A match lit at ankle height would die from lack of oxygen, while the same match would burn normally at face level, initially. She demonstrated this effect using the carefully controlled quantity of dry ice, showing how the invisible gas created a deadly atmosphere that rose slowly but inexorably. The coin slot had been blocked with a mixture of wax and eau de cologne, she continued, ensuring that Sir Lionel's payment would not register properly. The line would remain open, holding him in the box while the carbon dioxide did its work. Lady Bantry shivered as the demonstration revealed the full horror of Sir Lionel's final minutes. He would have realized what was happening, wouldn't he? That he couldn't breathe properly. Dr. Haydock nodded solemnly. Carbon dioxide poisoning can be insidious. Initial symptoms include dizziness and shortness of breath, which might have been attributed to the fog or the confined space. By the time the danger became apparent, it would have been too late. Throughout this explanation, Miss Phelps had remained silent, her face growing progressively paler. When Miss Marple began to discuss the psalm references and their timing, however, she finally spoke. The verses were meant to make him understand, she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of desperate justification. Psalm 7:16. His mischief shall return upon his own head. He needed to know that justice was being served. Miss Marple turned to face her directly. But what justice, Miss Phelps? The justice of punishing an innocent man for crimes he did not commit. Innocent? The word came out as a harsh whisper. Kenneth died because of his carelessness. Because he talked out of turn and compromised the operation. No, my dear, Miss Marple said with infinite gentleness. Kenneth died because Klaus Hoffmann betrayed him. Sir Lionel was investigating that betrayal, not perpetrating it. He was trying to clear Kenneth's name and expose the real traitor. She produced the official documents they had discovered in the parish files. These are the classified reports Sir Lionel was preparing to share with you. They prove that Kenneth was not the security breach. He was the victim of one. As Miss Phelps read the documents, her composure finally cracked. The careful control she had maintained throughout the investigation dissolved, replaced by a dawning horror at the magnitude of her mistake. I wanted him to know what it was to wait in a box, she whispered, echoing the cramped cell where Kenneth had awaited execution. I thought he would come out gasping, frightened, understanding what Kenneth went through. I never meant for him to die. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his official duty requiring him to make the arrest despite the tragic circumstances. Miss Margaret Phelps, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Lionel Hesketh. But even as the formal words were spoken, Miss Phelps seemed to have withdrawn into herself, overwhelmed by the revelation that she had murdered the one man who might have brought her the justice she had sought for 8 long years. War goes on, she said distantly, as Inspector Slack gently led her away, only colder. Later that evening, as the village settled into its familiar rhythms, Lady Bantry and Miss Marple sat in the comfortable sitting room of the old vicarage, reflecting on the day's tragic revelations. Such a small space for so much evil to unfold, Lady Bantry observed, glancing toward the window where the red telephone box was visible in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. Cold instruments suit cold resentments, my dear Dolly. Klaus Hoffmann used Miss Phelps's grief as a weapon, turning her love for Kenneth into something destructive and terrible. But she'll hang for it, won't she? Despite being manipulated, Miss Marple considered this gravely. The law must take its course, but I believe the circumstances will weigh heavily in her favor. She was as much a victim of Hoffmann's machinations as Sir Lionel was, though in a different way. Through the window, the telephone box stood silent in the evening mist, its cheerful red paint unable to dispel the shadow of tragedy that would forever mark it in the collective memory of St. Mary Mead. The saddest part, Miss Marple continued, is that Sir Lionel's death has achieved exactly what Hoffmann intended. The investigation into the 1947 security breach dies with him. The real traitor remains safe while an innocent woman pays the price. For his crimes. As the church clock struck 9, the same hour at which Sir Lionel's body had been discovered, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible arithmetic of revenge, how one death in 1947 had led inexorably to another in 1955, and how the pursuit of justice could so easily become its own form of injustice when guided by a malevolent hand. The mystery was solved, but its solution brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge of how easily human emotions could be corrupted and turned toward destructive ends. In the end, the true mystery was not how Sir Lionel had died, but how love and grief could be so skillfully transformed into instruments of murder.